I remember going into my history class that day and seeing the television on. It took a minute for it to register that the first tower had been hit. I watched through class, no one really paying attention to class, all eyes on the TV. We watched as the second plane hit the tower. I can remember the reporter's voice changing into a scream as it hit. This is the point where I realized it wasn't an accident and our country had been attacked. I heard later that day that the Pentagon might also have been hit, but most people were saying it was just a rumor. When I got home, I sat in the TV room watching in awe. I learned the Pentagon had indeed been hit. I watched feeling sick to my stomach, trying to think of how these people who were trapped in the building could get out. These thoughts were wiped away when I watched in horror as the towers fell. I remember mixed emotions. I was scared, not really sure what was going on. I was sad seeing so many innocent people die. But most of all, I was angry. I knew that someone had attacked our country, and we would make them pay.
Whenever I think about that day, the first thing I always remember is fire. Fire, deep fire, glowering, sputtering, hissing throughout the night and the long days to follow. Fire and choking smoke, thick and heavy enough to form an impenetrable barrier, the city skyline lost behind boiling black clouds. Sometime after 9 a.m. on 9/11, I stood up in my office and declared, "My friend is an asshole." A coworker's head popped over the partition in curiosity. "He just told me," I continued, "that a plane drove into the World Trade Center in New York. What kind of a joke is that?" This friend was continually tricking me into believing ridiculous things, but this one was simply too incredible for my gullible self to accept. It couldn't have happened. Could it? The room broke out in a flurry of typing as we dove for our favorite search engines and started surfing news sites. The silence, as we each located articles confirming our fears, was replaced by hysteria. 10 minutes later, the entire office gathered in the executive conference room in front of the flat-screen TV. Our mouths covered by horrified hands, we watched the two towers fall, heard the Pentagon had been hit. Many people started to cry. I couldn't begin to. A dull ache was all I could manage. My father-in-law worked at the Pentagon. Was he alive? I lived across from the Pentagon. Was my apartment gone too? I couldn't go home. D.C. was thrown to chaos. The streets clogged, the metro stopped, people running and crying and screaming everywhere. I walked instead from Metro Center all the way to Union Station to hole up in a friend's house until the city calmed enough that I could go home, provided I had a home to go to. I sat with my phone on continual redial, trying to call my family, my husband's family, my husband. There was so much we didn't know, and so much we couldn't bring ourselves to believe. Around 6 p.m., I finally made my way home. They had just reopened the Pentagon City Station. At my front door, I was questioned by an FBI agent. They'd shut down our roof and were questioning everyone in the building to see if anyone had seen the plane actually hit. I shook my head warily, answered his questions as quickly as I could, and headed upstairs. The windows in that apartment were huge, nearly floor-to-ceiling affairs. I stood at them, staring out at the confusion and chaos going on at the burning Pentagon, staring at the heart of the destruction, and for the first time I thought to myself, maybe this isn't the safest place to be living. Everything I did in the next few days was dominated by the sight outside my window. Climbing clumsily up onto the narrow ledge, I draped blankets over the windows with a cold, controlled fury, so that I wouldn't have to see the sharp redness of fire stabbing through the vertical blinds, so I wouldn't have to wonder if those bright embers that wouldn't go out were the remains of someone's father, mother, friend. It was too much to look at all day long. My heart was already too heavy. All of our hearts were.
September 11th, 2001. I was far from any of the events that occurred on that day, but my mind couldn't have been separated from them by any means. Hundreds of miles from my family in the Washington, D.C. area, I sat in a classroom at Oak Hill Academy in Southwest Virginia. Rumors began about a plane crash in New York. The teachers abandoned their classrooms to speak amongst each other in the hallway. Soon the student body was gathered in the assembly hall where the president broke the news to us. He made it clear that America had been attacked at the Pentagon and in New York. He reminded us to pray fervently for anyone in the areas and to remain calm. I left in search of a phone where I tried contacting everyone in my family. I was worried about my mom, who took the bus to the Pentagon to walk across the street every morning. It took a while, but I eventually reached my aunt, who told me everyone was okay. As I stood in the office redialing every number I knew, I unbelievingly stared at the images on the television. Later in the day, I sat pensively in my quiet dorm room. "What do we do now?" I asked one of my neighbors. I'm still waiting on the right answer.
I was sitting in second block geometry class the second week of my freshman year at Kellum. We were copying notes off the overhead when another teacher walked into the room and whispered something to our teacher, and then quickly walked right back out of the room. My teacher looked at us and turned on the TV, and I remember just seeing mass chaos all over the news. Between classes, I had heard something about a plane crash, but brushed it off as nothing that big, or a senior prank. The news was covering a huge story about a plane that had flown into one of the World Trade Towers. Most of us stopped copying notes and just watched. We were watching as the second plane hit the other tower, and all I can really remember is the chaos that ensued on the news. The people running and screaming, the debris falling from the sky, the people crying, and the silence that blanketed our classroom. No one knew what to say or do. We just sat there and watched. The timelines that are out now say that 40 minutes later the Pentagon was hit, but it felt like an eternity, and I can't imagine what the people in New York were feeling at the time. A few minutes after the news began talking about the attack on the Pentagon, the principal came over the loudspeaker. Teachers and students, Kellam is now on lockdown. All classes and portables, please report to the library immediately. Students may not leave the classrooms during the bell unless accompanied by a teacher. Between bells, students may not leave the building. Teachers, please close all windows and blinds and shut all doors. Most of what went on that day remains in my memory as a jumbled mess of news footage and a strange feeling of paranoia. I live in Virginia Beach, and we have the largest military installation in the country. There are 18 bases within 30 miles of my house. Everyone figured we were the next target. Every 15 minutes an announcement was made, calling 20 or so students to go to the office to go home. And I knew I wasn't going anywhere. My mom is a teacher and my stepdad is a federal government employee, and I was stuck at school. I didn't know what time it was, but I remember hearing a large number of planes flying over, and I could tell by the sound of the engines they were F-14s and F-18s. And I kept thinking, why are they leaving? Even though I realized that it was an effort to keep the planes safe. On the ground they're sitting ducks. In the air, they're forced to be reckoned with. It took about half an hour of noise before there was silence and all the planes were gone. That silence was terrifying. I was told later that around 1:45, 5 warships and 2 aircraft carriers left Norfolk. The USS George Washington and the USS JFK were sent to guard the New York coast. The other ships were sent to different locations along the eastern coast, and they were guided missile destroyers capable of shooting down any aircraft. For those in New York and Washington, D.C., 9/11 was a terrifying experience. For me, it was the night and days following the attacks that were the scariest. The silence that ensued, the blue skies above that acted like nothing had happened. Everything seemed fine, even though it wasn't, and I remember that for 3 days, not a single plane flew over. There was no jet noise. It seemed as though we were all straining our ears in an effort to hear just one of them. Or maybe we were waiting for something else. When the planes did come back and the skies were filled with that familiar sound, it seemed as though there was a weight lifted off our shoulders. Having the planes back meant that life could move on for Virginia Beach. Having the planes back meant that we were safe.